Today's gospel reading is from Matthew 28, 1 through 10. I know you've heard it before, but maybe you'll get a new reflection upon it today. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He's not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Thanks be to God.
Good morning. Has anybody seen the movie The Imitation Game? Anybody seen The Imitation Game? All right. So it's a story about Alan Turing. He was a man very much ahead of his time. He thought very differently, and he built the world's first computer. It was a complex calculation machine that the English used to break the Nazis' Enigma code during World War II. There's no doubt that without Turing's machine, the war would have lasted much longer with far greater loss of life. There's a scene in the movie where they finally break the code using the machine, and they use it to uncover the fact that there are some German U-boats that are massing to attack a British convoy. And it kicks off a furious debate between these scientists about how they can best use this information decoded from Turing's machine. When they break each message, how much should they divulge to the armed forces? They fear that if they use too much of it, the Nazis will change the Enigma code, and all that code-breaking work will be lost, and the machine will be useless. So they figure out a statistical formula to help them cover the fact that they have broken the code. They only use enough information to turn the tide of each particular battle. And it works. The rest of the war, the Nazis never discover the fact that the Enigma code has been broken. Turing and his machine and his process work perfectly. A brilliant success. Because it's not about just the information you have, but it's about how you use the information that you have. In thinking about the Easter sermon this year, I was struck by the fact that I often preach the facts of a story and the implications of the story, but we never get into the use of the story, because this is a practical story. All of us gathered here today probably know about the resurrection story. If you don't know about the resurrection of Jesus on Easter, Google it. You may not necessarily believe it, but even if you do, I'm willing to bet that most of us don't know what to do with it. Do we tell other people about it? Do we go home from church and eat dinner as if it never happened? I mean, what do we do with it? What do we do with the information that we have? Is it good information? The truth is that in the church, and like everything else, we are long on information and short on action. I read an article that said, despite the fact that people don't read books anymore, human beings read more words in a day than at any point in history. We just tend to read them 140 characters at a time. We are overwhelmed with information to the point where we don't really know what to do with it. Well, what can we really do? Well, I think maybe we should look back at what they did on the first Easter. And what did they do later because of the resurrection of Jesus? So normally we read from the Gospel of John. That's the normal Easter Day lectionary passage. It's John 21 through 18. But I'd like to read the Easter Vigil passage from the Gospel of Matthew today. If you've been following along the lectionary this year, most of the Gospel readings this year actually come from the Gospel of Matthew. I like this version of the resurrection account. Matthew has this wonderful use of imagery throughout the entire story. And so here's how he describes the first Easter morning. In verse 1 it says, "After the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb." They just went to look. They weren't really maybe sure what they were going to do, but they wanted to see where Jesus was buried. And so they just went to look. And then suddenly everything changes. If you look at verse 2, there was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. I like how matter-of-fact Jesus is. Oh, just this angel, and he rolled the stone back and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Last week, during Palm Sunday, I talked about how the word for earthquake and the word for stirred and the word for shaking is the same in Greek. And this word comes up a lot during Matthew's account of Palm Sunday and Holy Week. First, Jerusalem was stirred as Jesus entered the city. Then Jerusalem was shaken by an earthquake when he died. Then an earthquake shook the ground as an angel came and opened the tomb. And then the soldiers posted there guarding the tomb shook with fear. Everything here is shaking, fearful, and trembling. Because this is a power beyond any power on earth. Beyond the religious power of the temple authorities, beyond the power of the military of the Roman Empire. This is a power beyond earth. And Matthew wants to make sure that we understand that. So what does this angel say to the women after all this shaking? He says in verse 5, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going on ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." Again, the angel is very matter-of-fact here. Don't be afraid. It's the same message that the angel gave to Mary when he told her that she would be the mother of Jesus. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Come and see the place where he lay. When's the last time somebody told you not to be afraid? When you were a kid and someone like your mom and dad told you not to be afraid, it was comforting, right? Maybe you could think back to the first thunderstorm that you remember. Who told you not to be afraid? Who told you to enjoy the lights and the thunder? And today you realize that most thunderstorms really aren't anything to be afraid of, even if the Weather Channel says, run for your life. But fear as an adult is different, isn't it? It's a bit more problematic because we know more, don't we? When a doctor tells us not to be afraid because we've been diagnosed with something serious, we know better, right? Because The doctor doesn't know. There are no guarantees. When we've been laid off, company tends to be very impersonal, doesn't it? It's not personal, it's just business. Don't worry about it. I'm sure you'll find another job with another company. But we know better, and we feel a sense of fear. Or if someone tells us not to be afraid of something, we may think, well, I wasn't afraid until you told me. Now I wonder why you told me that. The fear we feel isn't like the fear we have as kids during a thunderstorm. The fear we have as adults feels bigger than us. So if God tells us not to fear, how is that any different? Well, it's all about where the information comes from. How good is the information? How reliable is it? What can we do with it? If the Creator of the world tells us not to fear, then we have nothing to fear. These two women in our story have seen this incredible thing unfold before their eyes early on a Sunday morning. And they're being told not to be afraid, but instead to go deliver a message to the disciples. Can they trust the message from this angel? Well, they sort of do, don't they? If we look at verse 8, they're both joyful and still afraid. So the women hurry away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." One last time, don't be afraid from Jesus himself. Someone they know they can trust. And fear is not something that's mentioned again in Matthew's gospel. Instead, the women go to deliver the message to Jesus, and it says they meet him in Galilee. Again, if Jesus himself, after walking out of the tomb, he's not a zombie, he's not undead, he's a living, breathing person. If he tells us not to fear, then we can trust the message. I mean, there are a lot of takeaways that we get from the resurrection. You maybe have heard more than one Easter sermon before. It's a healing event, as I described this morning at the sunrise service. It's an act of redemption. Obviously, it's a pretty rich theological event to mine. It's a lot of things. And it's been a lot of different things to Christians over the centuries of church history and church theology. Volumes have been written about the death and resurrection of Jesus. But the very first message of Easter is to let go of fear. And though they were briefly afraid, Jesus' disciples soon stopped being afraid. And once they left fear behind, they changed the world. If Jesus appeared to you and told you not to be afraid, what would you do? Jesus wants you to trust him. He wants you to follow him. It doesn't mean that things will be easier, that suddenly your life is going to go along perfectly, because that never happens. It doesn't mean freedom from the reality that you and I face each day, because there are days that we face some real darkness. But it does mean that he's going to get you through it. It does mean that regardless of whatever powers of this world come against you, whatever it be, whether it's health, whether it's finances, whether it's something like crime or injustice, even death itself, Jesus is bigger than those things, and he's overcome all of those things and more. When you follow him, Jesus puts his spirit into your heart. He gives you a dream or a vision, and he asks you to follow him. Most of us don't, though, and most churches don't, because we're afraid that we have too much to lose. But if you want to take anything away from Easter this year, if you want to take anything away from Christianity in general, it is this. It is to live for Christ without fear. Now, I'm not telling you here to follow your heart. That's, you can follow your heart from anywhere. That's not the Christian message. The Christian message is to follow Christ with all of your heart, without fear. The most compelling way you can live your life, the biggest way you can change your world, is to live for Christ without fear. To love others without fear. To serve others without fear. To give to others without fear. To open your heart to others without fear. To confess your sins and shortcomings without fear. The reality of the resurrection isn't going to change anything in your life unless you use it. There's an awful lot of fear in our world today, isn't there? It's fear that with Christ isn't necessary. No matter what social media or any politician tells you, fear not. Christ is bigger than our fears and is victorious over all the powers of this world. If we use our energy for something other than fear, we can use an awful lot of energy on fear, don't we? Uses up all our energy. What can we do instead with that energy? What can we do for our families? What can we do for our community? What could we do for our country and for our world if we just didn't fear anymore? God has a plan, and He wants you to be a part of it. It's a plan that begins every Easter and moves forward. This is your year to move without fear with Jesus. This is our church's year to move forward without fear with Jesus. Most of the world knows something about Easter, and even if they don't, they can Google it, right? But we can show people how it matters, how Easter matters, by how we live as Jesus followers. So it's very simple. Live without fear and live for Him. The tomb is empty. There is no reason to fear anymore. Happy Resurrection Day. Amen.